Hi, hi everyone. Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Juste un mot de présentation et d'ouverture en français avant de passer à une rencontre qui aura lieu en anglais ce soir. On est ravis de vous retrouver pour cette nouvelle saison des rencontres de PSSP. On a programmé toute une série de rencontres et de réflexions cette année pour faire vivre une réflexion collective qui a émergé sur les questions d'engagement philanthropique pour la démocratie. Ce sera le thème de ce soir. On est très heureux. Rémi, à la fin de la séance, vous donnera les dates, ou pourra les faire circuler dans le chat, les dates des prochains rendez-vous. On est très heureux de vous accueillir pour ce soir, pour le premier débat de notre année. Je vais switcher en anglais. On s'était donné cette règle de présentation. We are very happy to host tonight, this evening, for our first debate on the philanthropic engagements for democracy and civil rights. Two major speakers and actors of this conversation. Sarah Durieux, Director of Multitudes Foundation, a European foundation offering financial, technical, and strategic resources to political change makers. Thank you very much, Sarah, for being with us and sharing some thoughts about the political commitments of philanthropy, and many questions we will have the possibility to address this evening. And the other speaker is Elisa. She's the fund director of Civitates, a pooled philanthropic fund supporting independent media and civil organization throughout Europe. So someone who has this very broad perspective on the many challenges that the civic space and democracy are facing nowadays in Europe. Before giving the floor to our guest, I'd like to make a few introductory comments to our discussion and evoke the fact that the political dimension of philanthropic engagements is on the rise, and some events and some sequence of events have raised attention on this dimension of philanthropic activity. And to mention a few, recent protests in March in Georgia or in May in Hungary have shed light on the progressive withdrawal of the rule of law and civil rights in Eastern Europe. And media pluralism is in the decline in some of its countries. And this has led to a wake-up call that is not restricted to Eastern Europe, but that has gained traction in Western Europe too, where the control of media house and the reduction of the pluralism has been observed as well. And these events can be interpreted as an outcome of processes happening everywhere around Europe, and this narrowing and shrinking of civic space is now a major preoccupation for many actors of civil society, and of course for philanthropic actors and foundations. And that's the reason why we have thought that it would be very important and relevant to give the floor to some of the actors who are fighting today against these processes in their organizations, in their personal commitments, with different backgrounds, and who tackle these processes from different perspectives. And so we thought that Sarah and Elisa were ideally placed in their respective roles to provide us with an understanding of what is happening really on the ground and what can be the responses that philanthropic actors can provide to these very preoccupying trends. And one last word, both of presentation of the program and a word to the Fondation de France, who is with the other partners, the Fondation Daniel et Nina Carasso, the Fondation Caritas France, and the PhilAb, our colleagues and friends from Quebec. Tonight, Maya Spanu, who is the head of the observatory of the Fondation de France, should have been with us, and unfortunately, she couldn't be here tonight. But nonetheless, I'd like to really underline the fact that she's a player, a very important player of this conversation right now, and she has pushed forward some of the issues. We will talk together, so we will have a thought for her, and of course she will join back the conversation very soon, and we'll be sure that all of the things we will say tonight will resonate with her thoughts and the way she is framing some of the elements of the agenda of the Fondation de France. So that being said, I will give the floor right now to both of our speakers, maybe Elisa first and Sarah then, just for a first question that is very, very simple, and is to ask you what is exactly the role of Civitates on the one end, Multitudes on the other end, and could you provide us with some concrete examples of the kind of activity you are developing on your respective fields, supporting media on the one hand, and supporting what you call political change makers on the other hand? Thank you very much again. Elisa, the floor is yours for this first round of discussion.
Thank you, Nicolas. Thank you, Remy. Thank you for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here, especially in 2024. That's been coined the super election year around the world, not just in France, but as you know, we've had elections at the European Union level, and of course, all the eyes are like set on the US with their upcoming elections in a couple of weeks. So often when we speak about democracy, we think election. Democracy is much wider than that, but this year, the democracy conversation among philanthropic foundations has been very alive. I'll share my screen. I have a couple of slides about Civitates so that you can see them while you listen to me. So Civitates is the European Democracy Fund. We were established just about 6 years ago, very much as a result of what was happening in countries like Hungary and Poland with the rise of authoritarian populist leaders, closing civic space, capture of independent public interest media. And so a dozen foundations came together in solidarity with independent civil society leaders and independent journalists still operating in those countries, and put their resources, their money, their networks, their ideas together to start this pooled fund, these shared resources in the service of protecting those counterpowers. Independent civil society organizations and independent journalists often act as counterpowers that hold power to account. So fast forward 6 years later, we're now 23 foundations around the table. We've disbursed around 15 million euros across 19 countries in the European Union. And our grant making is done alongside 3 different portfolios. The first one is called Civic Power. So in that portfolio, we support essentially broad, diverse coalitions of civil society organizations that organize together at a national level to fight back against closing civic space, against restrictions on fundamental liberties, the freedom to protest in particular, which is under threat in many European countries, and respective governments in their respective countries in public policy making, public decision making processes. So, for instance, Civitates has been supporting women's organizations and youth groups in Poland, which, as you know, have been instrumental in the elections last year in ousting the populist government that had been in power for several years. And without the vast mobilization of these young and female voters in Poland, it's likely that the populist government would have stayed in place. So I don't want to take credit for Civitates having saved the elections in Poland, but I think we definitely played a role in strengthening those grassroots movements that then mobilized ahead of the elections. Our second portfolio, grant-making portfolio, is around tech and democracy. And so looking at the impact of especially new information technologies such as social media and their impact on public discourse, their impact and responsibility in spreading disinformation, fake news, but also hate speech and fear, especially ahead of key contested elections. So in that portfolio, for instance, we've been supporting mostly advocacy organizations active in Brussels that advocated for a strong regulation of online social platforms such as Google and Facebook and so on. And so as a result, earlier this year, the Commission passed the DSA, the Digital Services Act, alongside a number of other regulations related to the tech sector, the Digital Market Act, the AI Act, and so on. And Civitates will continue to support organizations, including in France, but also in other priority countries in the EU, to implement that legislation at the national level, which we hope will force the big online platform to be more transparent about the type of algorithms they use, the micro-targeting they do of their users, and ways in which they should prevent disinformation, especially, again, ahead of key elections. And then finally, and thirdly, we have a grant-making portfolio on media, in which we support independent public interest media outlets across Europe. So both investigative outlets such as Bellingcat, which some of you may be familiar with, as well as just local, national news media. And most of the media organizations we support are nonprofit. As you know, the traditional legacy media, their business model has been put upside down with social media and the advertising model on which social media is based. And so the traditional legacy news media is in crisis. So a lot of the media we fund are small, medium-sized outlets that are non-profit in nature. One example of what we support in that portfolio is a small media outlet in Romania, which produces news in Hungarian. So why would you say, why produce news in Hungarian in a country that speaks Bulgarian? Well, there is a small but important minority of Hungarian speakers in Romania. And guess what? That minority who doesn't speak Bulgarian gets access to the propaganda from the country next door, Hungary, in which the media has essentially been bought by the Orban government, by the state, and kind of propagate state propaganda. And so by financing and funding a small media outlet that provides quality information in Hungarian to the Hungarian minority in Romania, we're hoping to counterbalance and provide a more diverse news ecosystem to that community. So those are three examples of what we've been funding, handing it over to my choice to grant making are based on 4 key principles. First, we provide core, long-term, flexible grants, always 2 years or more. Some of our grantee partners have been receiving funding from us for the past 5 years. And we allow the organization to use our core funding in the way that they think is most effective for them. So some of them might use it to create a new role, a fundraising role, for instance, or to organize meetings, but we leave it to them to use the money as they see most effective. The second approach to grant making that is quite specific to Civitates is that we have a cohort approach. So we bring all our grantees together around meetings, convenings where they can share lessons, learn from each other, potentially establish new ways to collaborate. So especially in the media portfolio, it's been really interesting how some of our grantee partners from Portugal or from Greece started transborder investigative projects with media in Germany or in the Netherlands, for instance, that wouldn't have happened without us bringing them together. We put a big accent on learning and well-being. Closing civic space takes a huge toll on the mental health of independent journalists and independent civil society activists and leaders because of the harassment and the threats they're often subjected to. So we've created a new fund specifically to support the mental health and the well-being of the teams of the organizations we support. And finally, we try to be as inclusive, open, and transparent as possible, realizing that we know a lot of organizations, but we also know probably that there are many organizations that are not on our radar. So we do open calls. We just did a series of open calls this year, and we'll have open calls for applications again next year to allow a more diverse set of organizations to apply and eventually to benefit from Civitates grants. So I leave it at that. Happy to take questions, of course, if any, on what we found and what we've learned. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Elisa. It was very useful to set the stage of your interventions, and of course it raises a lot of questions, but I will not enter them right now. Leaving the floor to Sarah for a presentation, as long as or as short as you wish, Sarah, of Multitudes Foundation, and what are you doing, and what do you call a change maker?
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very glad to be here also with Elisa. I think we are two of, like, the, as you said, Nicolas, two of the committed, I would say, advocate for more funding in that space of democracy. And I think it's really great that both our organization exists to kind of complete the kind of portfolio we offer to support organizations. So Multitude is a European foundation. It's a foundation that is operating across Europe, supporting grassroots projects that are working to make politics more inclusive, hopeful, and human. The reason why we decided to work on this question is that until now, there has been very little funding in the philanthropic space to support what is like a non-partisan approach to political philanthropy. So basically, our analysis was that if we want to reimagine democracy, we need to have a better functioning representative democracy, because in most of European countries, we still have elections, we still have people who are elected and who make decisions that affect people's lives. And so our analysis is that the lack of representation, the lack of inclusion in the institutionalized politics space creates bad policies, creates disengagement, creates polarization, and therefore we need to address this specific part of the democracy work, which is building inclusive democracy where political power can be exercised by as many people as possible, and in particular, people who have been marginalized for many different reasons because of who they are, where they're from, their level of education, whether they are disabled or able-bodied, et cetera, et cetera. So those are some of the analyses that brought us to create Multitudes. Multitudes was created also on the base of what we've heard from the field. So the founders of Multitude have been doing some philanthropic and grant-making work in democracy for quite some time. And what we heard from those grantees were like, we would love to kind of continue the work we do in advocacy to maybe support people to be able to run for office and to basically like add to our strategy the question of political power. And so hearing from them, one, that this was a strategic way to go about democracy work, but so also because they weren't able to really fund a lot of their work, we decided to set up Multitude as a re-granter, which means that basically we're working with philanthropic partners from across Europe who want to test and learn this new philanthropy because it's quite new and there isn't a lot of investment in that field yet. And so they want to test it through us, which is like reassuring. And it's also a way for us to help them discover the kind of project we can support. So the work we do, as I said, is European in the sense that we fund all across Europe, not only the EU, but the continental Europe, let's call it like that. And we're also making sure we fund grassroots projects. So it's not necessarily projects that are kind of EU-wide institutional project that you might sometimes see, but more grassroots groups who see political power building as a way to address the crisis of democracy. So in some way, I'm not going to repeat, but I think like Elisa and I, we share like the kind of same approach to philanthropy, trying to have core funding, unrestricted, especially in our case, because we're working with a field that's quite new. So we want people to be able to imagine new solutions, but also we want this to be accessible to the vast majority of people. And given that our focus is on people who have been excluded from this space until now, we also want to make sure that it goes all the way to the people who are the most affected by political lack of representation. And so shortly, like we incubate some projects. So we give small grants to individuals or to collectives to build new projects to make politics more inclusive, but we also support more established organizations that have been there for some time. What we work on, there are different aspects. I think sometimes we like, okay, what does it mean exactly? You know, what is political reimagination? What is political inclusion? So I'm just going to give 3 examples of what we're funding. One project that we've been really seed funding and we're very excited about what they're doing is in France. It's called Démocratiser la politique, and I'm just sharing the link now. So it's an initiative that works on social representation in politics, knowing, for example, people from the working class are really underrepresented in politics, and what does that mean for the kind of policies that are voted in parliament? Are they really inclusive? So this initiative, we really help them basically to get started, and they're now having a lot of success, like organizing workshops all across France with people from working class background, thinking through ways that we can change the system for it to be more inclusive for people of that background. And you can discover more about their work on their website. So that's one of the type of work we're doing is to basically, how do we create more inclusive space? Second type of work that we are supporting is everything that's around supporting and helping train new leaders to different level of leadership. So I shared with you Fanta Politica, which is an Italian organization that we are also supporting for 2 years now. And so Fanta Politica is training and supporting a network of youth leaders who are under 30, who want to run for municipal election. So who want to be part of municipal council, because we know that municipal level is also a good way to learn how to do politics. And so we think that's a good way also to build a new generation of political leaders. And finally, another example, which is a much more established organization that we are supporting in Germany, is Brand New Bundestag. And what's really interesting with Brand New Bundestag is that they mix this idea of supporting activists who are building power around specific issues like climate or gender equality to help them get into office, but also work in a transpartisan way once in office to pass some legislation that allow for a more inclusive society. So those are 3 examples of what we're funding. I'm going to stop there, but we have basically identified now around 100 different organizations that are doing this kind of work across Europe, and we are hoping to support more of them in the coming years.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, as well as Elisa. Before turning our eyes towards the next questions, the processes that are undermining the civic spaces in Europe, I'd just like to to ask you a very quick question, because there are some relationships between what you're doing on both of your sides. And my question is simple. And Sarah, do you have in mind, or in the projects you support, some dimensions that deal with media and the way minorities, underrepresented groups are entering the media sphere and have access to the floor in this sphere? And Elisa, you mentioned the issue of providing some minorities in Bulgaria, access to the media. And do you have a focus on this way to help disadvantaged groups to have a voice in the societies you're working inside? Maybe Sarah first, and then Elisa. Just a quick questions to make a bridge between both of your actions and foundations.
So I think that one of the things that's really exciting and yet very heartbreaking with the work we do at Multitude is that we set up to fund something that's underfunded, which means that we are trying to be very specific on what we are focused on, and therefore really support projects that have in their mission, even if it's a long term, it can take some time to build that up, but the idea of reimagining who's holding power. So if in the project, there isn't like the idea of building political power for certain groups that are underrepresented and helping them exercise power, we wouldn't prioritize this. But there's a lot of other projects, for example, that we fund. I'm taking Fanta Politica just as an example, who are actually training those leaders to enter the media space and enter like, for example, like train themselves to be like better speakers and have good strategies on how they can influence the media landscape and how they can influence the media conversation. So in some way, that's not like something we're focused on, but obviously, like a lot of the organization we work on are conscious of the big challenge we have with media representation and inclusion.
Okay, thanks a lot. Elisa, are you addressing the issues of rural communities, discriminated groups, young people, and their share in the media and in the public voice?
So we believe in inclusive societies and inclusive democracies. So a lot of the coalitions we support, for instance, are very broad. So they include organizations that represent different interest group or different campaigns, right? So for instance, we fund an organization called the Bulgarian Fund for Women in Bulgaria. They're a feminist organization, but they've established a very wide platform with organizations working on intersectional issues that are related to democracy and feminism, but also LGBTQ plus rights, migrants' rights, youth rights. And so a lot of the coalitions, if not all of the coalitions we support, have that approach of like breaking silos and having inclusive coalitions that are able to present a common front, let's say, against the pushback that happens, again, across Europe, and that targets one or several of those groups. And same thing, around youth engagement. So as I mentioned, in Poland, we supported a coalition that included a lot of youth groups and women's organizations that together worked to mobilize their respective ranks, saying, look, we all need to go and vote for the elections because we can make a difference, right? So it's also really empowering when those groups come together and realize that together they can change the course of history.
Okay. Thanks a lot. That was very useful to make this connection and bridge between your preoccupations. When discussed about the topic of this conversation we're having this evening, we wanted to focus Before addressing the issues of your organizations, the philanthropic strategies, and the way to provide some room and some space to the groups we were talking about, we wanted to have a kind of, a mapping of the issues at play and the threats to democracies and the civic space that you are dealing with. And so I'd like to ask both of you, and maybe starting this time with Sarah, what are, according to you, the main signs of the crisis of the democracy we are facing today in our societies in the global north, maybe at a wider scale today? And Sarah, you talked in the preparation about some paradoxical trends at play in our societies. Can you elaborate a little bit about this idea and the way you see the landscape evolving?
Thank you so much. And I think that I just want to say where I'm talking from. So before joining Multitude, I was myself doing a lot of community organizing, of activism on many different issues. And I think that me coming to Multitude is also just a realization of this, the kind of democratic crisis we were in as advocates. When you're, advocating for rights, advocating for human rights or for climate justice, etc., you can sense that in your day-to-day work that, it's getting harder and harder. And I think I'm French and I'm based in France, and a lot of my activism has been in France. And I think what I've seen over the past years is that we went from, ignoring some of the social movements that existed to kind of cracking down on those movements. And I really think that's a trend we are seeing in all this, democracy we are part of, which is like, until 15 years ago, at least in France, like we had some kind of tech, because there was such high respect for organized civil society from political leaders and from political establishment that created, this kind of dynamic that was healthy between institutionalized power and civil society. And the more we move in time, the more I've seen like interaction moved into ignoring to repressing. And I think that's really the trend we are seeing as civil society, and something that's really worrying. And also cracking down on civil society, and I'm sure Elisa can say a lot about that as well, is not necessarily very direct and very fast. So it's also very difficult to grapple with as Democrats, as civil society organizer, to say, when have we passed the point where really democracy is not functioning well anymore? And so I really think that what's paradoxical, just to answer to your question, is that the harder it is for civil society, to create that healthy dynamic with political leadership, the more we are seeing actually a disinvestment from philanthropy. So I think philanthropy is very risk averse, and for a lot of philanthropists, being political is a real question, and I think we can go back to that. And so the more we have a political power that repress civil society and kind of portray it as partisan or as too political, the harder it is for philanthropy to engage. Whereas we actually would need philanthropy to be much more active before it's too late, before the civil society actors are portrayed as, are criminalized or are portrayed as too partisan. So I think for me, that's the kind of paradox, is that the worse situation is in democracy, the more philanthropists are worried to get in, because they're worried to be seen as political. And I understand, this risk that is taken by some philanthropists to also be attacked. I've been talking with some philanthropists who have been working on migrants' rights, for example, who have been worried about the attack. So I think we really need to get in this together. And the more people are actually engaging in a very transparent way with the democracy work, the stronger we are to say, actually, that's not partisan. That's the basis of our democracy, to have a vibrant civil society, to have a debate, to have media that are independent, that are able to give like vetted information, etc. So for me, that's the trend, like that's kind of the paradox we're seeing, but still very hopeful, because the reason I'm here is also because there's interest in investing in that work more and more, but we really need to get onto that. And I'll pass it to you, Elisa.
Okay, thanks a lot. We'll go back on this idea of these paradoxical challenges ahead for philanthropy. Elisa, you want to elaborate on these big issues you are dealing with?
Thanks. So absolutely agree with everything that Sarah said, and so that I think there's two questions. There's what are the signs of democratic decline in the European Union or in Europe, and then what are the underlying causes. So in terms of the signs of democratic decline, closing civic space is definitely one of them, as Sarah's already said. And according to the Civicus Monitor that kind of monitors civic space around the world, only 11 of the 27 EU member states have open civic space, right? So countries where fundamental freedoms of expression, association, assembly are respected and upheld. So closing civic space is definitely the first sign that our democracies are not doing well. Another one is the rise of populism. And in Europe at the moment, it's mostly far right and nationalist populism. And today, again, in the EU, 6 member states have hard right parties in government. So that's Italy, Finland, Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, and the Czech Republic, right? So populism on the rise. Thirdly, and associated with the rise of populism is increasing political polarization. So what you're seeing in society now is increasingly deep divisions along ideological, cultural, socioeconomic lines that are kind of fueling that populism. And then fourth, and finally, I think a trust crisis in institutions. There's declining public confidence in democratic institutions, including governments, but also the media, political parties. I read a statistic recently that really scared me. Apparently 15% of the French population think the army would be doing a better job at running the country than any political party, right? So closing civic space, rise of populism, political polarization, and a crisis of trust in the existing democratic institutions and processes kind of create that perfect storm for, like all the indicators of democracy being in decline. What I'd like to show you a slide now about, so at Civitates, we think this is not happening by chance, right? To some extent, this is happening by design. And what I mean by that is that here we're talking about progressive philanthropic foundations, right? Multitude, Civitates, where I would say progressive foundations that believe in the rule of law, playing by the rules, staying non-partisan, defending the institutions and the processes of democracy. But there are foundations that support those authoritarian and populist narratives and leaders. And so let me just try to share my screen here. Right. So there's what we call the authoritarian playbook, right? Like, what are the illiberal forces doing to undermine trust and the effectiveness of democracy? So first, investment in ideas, investment in kind of overarching ideas that are really easy for the public to kind of embrace. think, for instance, of the great replacement theory, right? The fact that white people might be replaced by Black immigrants in the next few years, that's really like fueling fear. In less than 2 decades, this theory has become a major idea. And in France, as many as 60%, so this time it's 60% of the French population believes in some aspect of the great replacement theory, right? Again, this has been, yeah?
I think we don't have the picture right now on the screen, so we are understanding perfectly what you are saying, but we cannot see the picture and the,
Oh, sorry, so I'll stop sharing.
The figures you're referring to, so yeah.
Yeah. So the investment in those kind of overarching ideas, right? That kind of make people believe in conspiracy theories or embrace populist narratives. Another thing, a second thing, is investment in stage capture. So what you're seeing from Hungary to Russia, Azerbaijan, you know, the US under a Trump administration, is that a lot of those populists circumvent the rules of the game, you know, the rule of law. You know, for instance, governments bypassing parliaments or capturing the judicial system or capturing media. And you know, Hungary's been particularly good at that, capturing, but also, you know, keeping a state of emergency and police powers long after the COVID emergency has been gone, right? So those are examples of like kind of capturing the apparatus of the state to serve a particular political interest. Thirdly, investment in value-based narratives. The illiberal forces are extremely good at that, and the progressive forces are, I think, less good at that. So you know, the example of the great replacement theory is one, but another one is that a lot of the centrist, you know, center-right, center-left parties now are being kind of successfully painted as a liberal elite that has completely lost touch with the needs and aspirations of normal people, right? This is an extremely successful narrative that a lot of people you know, are buying into, and which leads them to distrust governments or political parties. Fourthly, investment in the means of production and cultural hegemony. So I mentioned, you know, capturing state or private media, but illiberal forces also are very skilled at social media campaigns, micro-targeting, and disinformation. In countries like Poland and Hungary, for instance, you know, illiberal leaders in government have influenced education systems. They've embedded their ideology through curriculum change. They're instrumentalizing academic funding and have made a range of attacks on progressive scholars in those countries, right? So that's what I called kind of this investment in the means of like cultural hegemony. Go after the independent journalists, go after the independent scholars, and you know, those people, of course, then tend to self-censor because it can be dangerous to go against the state apparatus. Investment in transnational movement is another thing that populists have been very good at doing, and that we, Sarah and I, try to do on the other side of the spectrum. But you know, think of the Tea Party or the MAGA, Make America Great Again, or even the Brexit movement. I mean, those were very, you know, our grassroots movement. There are grassroots, you know, groups and narratives around this is going to be good for the people, right? And I think on the other side of the spectrum, we've had movements like this, like Me Too, or you know, the yellow vests in France, or, you know, Extinction Rebellion in the climate scene. But those movements, the kind of maybe what I would call more progressive movements, have not benefited from progressive philanthropic funding. We've stayed away, and that goes back to what Sarah was saying, right? The philanthropic foundations have been very timid in financially supporting those more progressive grassroots movements. And then finally, another thing that the illiberal or authoritarians do really, really well is investment in foresight. So thinking ahead of what may prevent the ideas to be successful in the public domain, and being very strategic over the course of several decades. And that's where, you know, the timeline is important here. I think Multitudes and Civitates, we're proud of ourselves because we give 2-year grants. The Heritage Foundation in the US, or, you know, more conservative foundations, give 10, 20, 30-year support to organizations they believe can help them achieve their political goals. The Koch brothers in the US have had one single aim for the past 50 or 60 years across, you know, 2 generations of Koch family members, to take down the US federal government, and they've almost succeeded, right? And so I think there's something that progressive philanthropy, pro-liberal democracy, you know, concerned philanthropy should, you know, I'm not saying we should, you know, apply all those tactics, but I think there's definitely things we can do better by applying some of those principles to support pro-democracy forces. And we can do that in a non-partisan way. So I'm happy to talk more about how, you know, this can be done in a non-partisan way. But I'm trying here to really, you know, convey the idea that democratic decline is not just happening by accident. I think to some extent it's happening by design, and it's being financed by some private philanthropic money.
Okay, thanks a lot. That's fascinating, and I think it resonates a lot with already some of the issues that Sarah has put forward. If you allow me just to elaborate 1 second on that, when you mentioned this paradoxical trends at play, Sarah, you were identifying, I think, one of the key characteristics of the polarization process. I mean, it's not a state, it's a process. And this process is cumulative. And one of the key dimensions of polarization we see ongoing in many countries is the fact that the voices of the center, the voices of the rights, of the, you know, humanistic perspectives, is being silenced either by force or by self-restriction when the debate is beginning to polarize. And so what you said about the shyness or timidity of philanthropic organizations is a much more broader issues of the voice of moderation and the voices of the center that are in a way turning down the volume of their expression in a context where the extremes are gaining traction. That was just a reflection on the on your point. And Elisa, we'll go back to you for the last questions, because you began to dig a little bit into some of the responses of philanthropic organizations. That will be the last question I will ask you before opening the floor. You mentioned two things that are very interesting. Am I right if I say that you suggest that in a way the coalitions, the progressive movements, you know, emit some of the tools that the conservative movements displayed? I mean, you talked about the scale of the commitment. And maybe it's not a coincidence if you act at the European level at a very large scale. You talked about the duration of the support, and the means, maybe it refers to the pooling of resources instead of being isolated, separated in your supports. And you talked about a discussion that we have had previously with Sarah, so I'm sure that she will react on that. How do you draw a line between being politically committed and being partisan? I mean, it's really a key issue, and so I ask you to, if you can, elaborate a little bit on that, and Sarah will provide a conclusion on our debate before opening the floor for a few minutes. Elisa, yeah. Your micro.
Sorry, I think my internet is a little unstable. I hope I'm not
have you heard the question?
No.
Okay. So I will make a long story short. Can you began to mention some of the responses that philanthropy can provide to the challenges, and you talked about the scale. You talked about the difference between being political and being partisan. And I raised the hypothesis that you were supporting a kind of imitation of the means of conservative movements for progressive ideals. Do you agree with this traduction of your words?
Imitation, I'm not sure, but maybe some inspiration, definitely in terms of the ambition and the scale. I'm going to try to share my screen again. Let me know if you can see it, because it's a table that kind of shows a framework for democracy philanthropy that's, I think, helpful to answer your question about, is democracy philanthropy, political or not? Can you see the screen or not?
No, unfortunately, Elisa, we don't see it.
I wonder if Remy, I don't know if Remy, you can share the slides I sent you about a framework for democracy philanthropy in the slide that I sent you. Anyways,
give me a minute.
thank you so much. But I can speak. So I think, and Sarah, feel free obviously to disagree with me, but I think there's ways as a non-partisan philanthropic foundation to invest in supporting democracy without entering politics. Of course you can, if your bylaws allow it and if your risk appetite allows it, but there's so many different interventions that foundations can support that are far away from politics. And so the table I wanted to show you is with at the top kind of the time involved. So whether you invest, for short-term projects, a year, less than a year, or in the mid-term for 2 to 5 years, or if you're investing for long-term change, right, 10 years or more. Oh, thank you so much, Remy. So if you scroll down, that's going to make it easier for me to explain. Yeah, so the one before. Thank you so much. So as you can, so what I said here at the top is the time scale, and then on the vertical axis is the geographic scale. So whether you invest in projects, organizations, initiatives that are national in nature, or international, EU level or local. And you see that different gradient of purple boxes. And basically the darker the purple, the closer you are to politics. And the lighter the purple, so on the lower right corner, the lighter the purple, the furthest away you are from partisan politics. So let me give you an example. Next slide, Remy, please. If you support voter registration and mobilization 6 months before a presidential or a legislative election, probably you may be perceived as being partisan, because of course, who do you register? Who do you mobilize, right? Some foundations do that. Civitates occasionally would do that in some contexts, right? But it's in the dark purple corner. It's national level, it's really exposed, and you're making sure some parts of the population who may not go and vote will go and vote, right? Just a few months before a major election. Usually that happens when the elections are really contested in a highly polarized context, right? So you may, again, be perceived as being partisan. Doesn't mean you are, but you may be perceived. Next slide, please. But if you fund organizations, for instance, that advocate to strengthen governing institutions or to pass new legislation, I mean, usually that's a longer time frame, right? It's like 2, 3, 4 years. It takes a while to change legislation. So Civitates, for instance, is supporting that type of work, especially in regards to our tech and democracy work. So we're supporting organizations that advocate in Brussels for a change in legislation at EU and national level to hold big tech to account, right? I mean, is this partisan? Not political, not. It's political in the sense that you try to change the rules of the game for big tech, but it's probably not perceived as partisan, right? So it's in this middle column where you can see it's not as the purple color is lighter. And then thanks, Remy, for the last slide. That's another example of what you can do. That's, you know, long-term investments. It can happen at the national, international, or local level. It's to support civic education. It's to support civic engagement. It's to teach young people their obligations as citizens, how to be engaged, how to make a difference, develop future leaders. You know, multitudes often is thought of as in the deep purple, I think, but you could also say like, look there, and, you know, Sarah, I'm like, again, happy to, you know, be disagreed with, but developing future leaders, right? Developing like civil society leaders, political leaders. I mean, that doesn't happen in 6 months or 12 months. It happens over several years. And it's about building that vibrant, engaged citizenry that's going to be able to make a difference, right? And so
okay.
Here, I think you're less likely to be perceived as partisans.
Okay. Okay. Thanks a lot. It's really interesting to have this distinction between being and being perceived, but because we know that in politics, being perceived is already part of the reality. So it's really important to have this reflection on how your action is received. Sarah, I know we know that you have a long-term and deep reflection on these issues of drawing a line between being political, between being partisan. And if you take the big picture, what are the best strategies for you, for philanthropic organizations, coalitions to react to the trends you've talked about, and to go beyond this timidity in a polarized and rude public sphere?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's my favorite part of the conversation. So I think I'm not going to break it up to anyone in this room. You're already doing political work. If you believe that kids need to have access to an education, if you believe that people should breathe clean air and drink clean water, I think you're being political. Because the reality now is that standing up for certain values is being political. And I really think we need to kind of differentiate what it means to be political from being supporting a political party. Like, really, that's super important. I really believe that the only way for us to make democracy work is to stand up for values, because democracy is not, let's just get everyone in a room to say whatever they want to restrict the right of others. Democracy is built to actually achieve what a society needs, for what every member of society need to access, so water, education, etc., you name it. So I almost don't want to go into, you know, like your presentation, Elisa, of like what is too political, because I think we really need to be honest with ourselves that as philanthropists, you know, we decide what is our mission, we decide what is our vision for the world, we decide where we're going to put our money. So we're anyway making political choices. What we need is to actually embrace the fact that there are places that we are not investing in, where we have political actors that are destabilizing the kind of balance, because as Elisa put it, like, it's true, like they put billions for many years for democracy not to work. So it's about rebalancing that. That's my first point, I think. The second thing I want to say is that if you're hoping to have a systemic impact, which means that you don't want just to put band-aids on a problem, but you really want to go to the root of the problem, you're anyway going to be political. Because if you start to look into why certain kids don't have access to school, if you don't want just to give them ways to go to school and be one of the few that will have the chance to have support, if you really want to address this question of education, you need to understand power imbalance in society, and power imbalance is reinforced by legislation, by politics, etc. So I'm really advocating for us to be honest, to say if we're trying to be systemic in our approach, we're going to be political. Now, I just want to go back to how can we do political work without being partisan? And I think, Elisa, I disagree to some extent to what you said, but I also agree with a big part, which is actually doing political work, not being partisan, is addressing the root cause of political dysfunction. So what are the root cause of political dysfunction? Party politics is not working well. It's not democratic, it's not inclusive. So you could even fund work to push political party to be more democratic. And this is like really political work, engaging with parties, but not being partisan. So if you look at Démocratiser la politique, this French example I gave, they're going to talk to every political party and say, look, like we've kind of looked at the data for the past 20 years, and you don't have 0.1% of people from working class background who are being elected. There's something wrong with your system. So I really, really think that's important to feel okay and to be like, okay, to not fall into the trap of the illiberal funders or illiberal forces that are telling us anytime you're trying to have a systemic approach, you're being so political, because that's a diversion technique to stop us from really addressing the root cause of democracy. Now, one point I think is really important to say, voter mobilization. I think it's important to do it. Honestly, I think just taking the example of France, if we didn't have like funders who pulled into like an urgent fund to do voters mobilization, we probably wouldn't be in the situation we are in today, or we would be in a worse situation that we are today. And so you can do voter registration, you can do voter engagement in a non-partisan way. You can have people who will go and knock doors to make sure that everyone gets their voice heard, because of course, the people who are less heard are often the people who are suffering the most from illiberal democracies. And so I really think that there are many, in some way in the graphic you show, Elisa, I think you can be non-partisan and you can have a systemic approach with whatever situation you're in. Either you do voter registration, either you do like party reform, or if you do political organizing, which is basically helping people build collective action that drive much more participation in the political processes. So it's almost like, just to sum it up, my answer is anywhere we are being political. And second, like if we are going to be political anyway, let's be transparent about it, and let's address the root cause of the malfunctioning of political work, because all illiberal democracies today, they are happening through elections. There's no coup happening anymore in most places in the world. So if we don't address the question of who's getting elected and why and how, then we are missing, I think, a very, very important point. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't fund, media and civic space, etc. For me, this is not a either or. It must be like completely, if you want to have a good portfolio on democracy, basically you should have a bit of everything, I think.
Okay, so thanks a lot. It's a wide array of actors, networks that need to be funded so that the civic space and democracy is sustained. Thanks a lot for all of the elements you brought in the discussion. I now turn to the people in the room and to the questions you may have. And of course, you can ask your questions in French. I mean, it does not make any problem for anyone here. So feel free to express yourself in the language you prefer. And I'm sure Sarah and Elisa will answer your questions. So are there some issues that you wanted to raise on my side? I have some, maybe Ebrima, you have some thoughts about the African landscape, and are you concerned with some of the issues? Lola, who is working on the philanthropic action in the migration in Greece. Please, Lola. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Hello, thanks to both of you. I will do my question in English, but I'm in advance sorry for my accent. My question is to both of you, but Sarah, you talked about Fanta Politica project, I think, and you talked about the importance of the municipal council. So I was wondering if firstly, if it's possible for you to finance this kind of institution directly or through maybe their non-profit entities, and secondly, if you already have some partnership and or request from the municipality to be supported, and if yes, why they would be addressing their needs to foundations. And maybe it's a lot of questions, but I think all it's connected. So are you noticing like a dynamic of initiative, a democratic to initiate a democratic change at the municipal level? And if yes, is it something new or it was always here? I don't know if I was clear.
Okay, thanks a lot. You raised two important questions: municipalization on the one hand, and the relationship between public and private actors. I mean, and how do you deal with this? Sarah, do you want to answer this question? That was.
Yeah, very quickly. So I think that the municipalities didn't reach out to us yet. So we fund Fanta Politica, which is an independent organization, which is a civil society actor that helps people get into municipal councils. But we have a lot of requests for funding, to be honest, for more participatory democracy type. Like one actor is Fréquence Commune, which is a French organization as well, who's working with municipality for them to have more inclusive processes. That's really cool. I don't think we've prioritized that just because it's not about, you know, like renewal of democracy per se, like who's holding power, but it's a really interesting entry. And for the funding, the reason why we set up Multitudes is also that we basically have two arms, one philanthropic and one non-philanthropic, which allows us much more flexibility on what we can fund. So in the case of Fanta Politica, oh, I'm hearing myself. In the case of Fanta Politica, for example, we were able, because they are not a non-profit, we were able to fund them through our non-profit arm. And I think that's also like, I mean, I don't know if we'll have time to go through that, but there are many creative ways as well to fund this kind of work, and to still maintain, you know, like a not-for-profit status and to support that kind of organization. Démocratiser la politique, for example, is a non-for-profit. So, you know, we kind of adapt to the grantees based on their legal setup, and that's the flexibility we have, and that's why we set up Multitude in the first place.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sarah. I will switch to Layad and Peggy. Maybe Ebrima, I saw your hand raised before that, but maybe you put it down. So Layad and Peggy first. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. Pleasure to be here. I'm very happy to be with you. And it's been years since I attended a session where I agreed with most of what have been said. So I'm extremely happy to see your insights. Thank you very much for sharing. I myself work around designing devices for countering political polarization that leads to violent radicalization in general. And my observation in agreement with the ladies is that the same methods that have been used by ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and so on, by radical groups in the East, are being used by the radical right in Europe nowadays, and they are leading to the same results, more or less. The only difference between the work that we're doing today and the work that they're doing is that we rely a lot on the persuasion theory rather than manipulation, and we believe in change theory rather than playing with ethical backgrounds. But I had a couple of questions to ask basically about your insights and your take on the back channeling and changing politics and the area of the gray areas that are usually related to the negotiation with the politicians under the table, behind the doors, and so on. This is on one end. And on the other end, I wanted to know about your reach to the donors, people who believe in the philanthropy and they want to give because they believe in the political change, but without being interested and without having any agenda-powered objectives behind the projects.
Okay, thanks a lot. If you don't mind, Elisa and Sarah, I will give the floor to the two other participants who wanted to ask questions so that you can answer them in a single round. Peggy,
Yes.
the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was really, really interesting, Sarah and Elisa. So my name is Peggy and I work for a consultant firm which is called La Cause, and we are implementing a work with different NGOs to establish safeguards measures in France to try to safeguard the civic space. So we are right in the middle of our subject. And I had a few questions. The first one is, do you think that since the last summer, where we all had a very difficult time in July, the association in France are now aware of the risks on democracy and on the civic space? Have you seen a change in the way they set up their strategy, for instance? The second thing is, I agree completely what you said about political and partisan, and I think it's a very old, how do you say that? In French, we would say serpent de mer. In French, in France, and in particular in NGOs, where we're talking about that like every 5 years, at least when we've got the presidential election. So, and since few days, I've been hearing these questions many times. So again, is it something that is changing? And do you think it's also changing among the NGOs in France, not only among the foundation, because it's also important? And last questions, do you have examples of pool funds that have been set up in Europe where foundation and NGOs together pool money together to fund common services, for instance, on psychological care for associative worker? And do you have example of that? I know that in Poland they have tried that, but and last question, sorry. Do you know? Do you in the foundation that you're working in? Do you also fund emergency? Do you have also an emergency fund for associations that are that have to face consequences of authoritarianism? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll take a last question of Ebrima, and then if you don't mind, Sarah will answer first, and she has a time constraint. And so please, Ebrima, be fast, and Sarah will answer right away.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm speaking to you from Dakar in Senegal, and I found the conversation very fascinating, and I want to thank the speakers. Both of them were really very impressive. You know, I mean, from where I am speaking, we really see the closing of civic space in a very big way. Unfortunately, when I think it's Sarah who said coups are now a reality, in our own space, we are seeing a resurgence of military coups. Over the last 2 to 3 years, we've had about 8 of them, mostly in West Africa, but also in Central Africa. And that creates a completely new, different kind of dynamic. I think the most serious case is there is an aspiration for democracy. All these studies carried out by Afrobarometer and a number of other institutions show that people want to live in democratic societies, right, where they can have the freedom to speak, to organize, and to live better. The problem is democracy doesn't seem to be delivering, right, on a number of fronts, neither on security, nor on jobs, nor on well-being, right? So the democracy is not delivering. And therefore, there's been some disappointment with liberal democracy. So the challenge is to try to reverse the trends with the military coups, because the military guys are saying, look, the civilians have been incapable of resolving these problems. So the best thing to do is, you know, we put democracy aside and then we deal with the issues of security, terrorism, all the violence that is around in this whole area, and then we can fix the economy as well. and it's not happening, right? We have seen in Senegal, on the other hand, this year, a group being elected, young people mainly, on the promise of bringing about systemic change. And I think they speak to basically the same issues, but it was evidence that it is possible to go about change and democracy in a different way. Now, on the 7th of October, I want to finish on that one. On the 7th of October, 4 foundations came together to launch what is called a West Africa Democracy Fund. That's Ford, Mercator, Open Society Foundations, and Luminate, and others are lined up to do that. Because the idea is to work around ways, and we are involved in that across Africa, to reimagine democracy, basically to reimagine democracy in our context, in which it's not only about being risk averse for the foundations. The foundations have been attacked. In Kenya, the government of Kenya wrote a letter accusing namely a number of foundations, US-based foundations, for being the ones behind the movement called Gen Z, a movement of young people that actually rocked the country over the last couple of months or so. So there's a lot happening now, and the challenge really is to rehabilitate democracy, to reimagine it, and to make it respond to the issues of security, of economic well-being of the people, and of participation, of course, broad-based and deep.
Thank you so much, Ebrima.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Ebrima. I will give the floor to Sarah, who has to leave you in 1 minute, I guess, Sarah. So just a conclusive word, and thanks a lot. And just to mention, it's an ongoing conversation we're going to have on these issues this year. So feel free to keep your thoughts in mind, and we'll go back to Sarah and Elisa if needed later on. Sarah.
Yes, thanks a lot. So I'm not going to answer every question because I don't have enough time, but I just want to talk to your comment, Iyad, sorry. I don't know, Iyad, sorry.
Iyad.
I think like there's a lot of our funders who are actually politically committed and not partisan led. I don't know how to say that. But one of our co-founder, for example, Daniel Sachs, has been committed to political renewal for quite some time. And I think he explains very well how he sees the importance of, being very political and being very non-partisan in the way they address that. And, we've built partnership with other organizations, including like some large foundation, either family or corporate foundations that are, following the same vision of a non-partisan, and therefore that's just to the point of Elisa, that's, long-term investment as well. So quickly on your comment, Peggy, on what happened since the election in France, I think we've seen a lot what it can mean to be non-partisan yet very political in case of an election. And I think a lot of the NGOs have kind of break their bubble to be like, no, we're not engaging in electoral moment. And I really think there's going to be a before and after. I think people have been just very savvy, either it's like foundation or association, to understand the moment and to be like, actually, we need to get together. What I hope is that we can do that not in urgent moments. So can we do the same thing we've been able to do, which is like, let's be very active around electoral moment. Let's be very clear about what's at stake while remaining non-partisan. I think we would be able to win so much if we were able to invest in that. And I have honestly a lot of hope, because a lot of the NGOs that I've been talking to, who are usually very distant from electoral moment, is starting to shift their vision and strategy. So I think it's a very good sign. And just quickly, I will just finish with this one, and sorry. On the fund emergency, I just want to go back to that, because when there was the election in France, there've been an emergency fund that has been pulled together, especially for French initiative, at least that I was aware of. I'm sure there were other initiatives. And I was both like really happy and excited that this happened, because I think that showed that philanthropists actually can do this work. But also very disappointed that we've been talking with some of these actors for like many years, and a lot of them still go to urgency mode when it comes to election. And if we really don't want to have to deal with the urgency, we need to have long-term strategic funding. And so I really hope that this conversation is going to shift from like funding urgently to funding long-term structurally, so that we don't have to worry about this kind of last-minute election. And I'll stop there. And thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for being with us tonight. And see you soon. We'll follow your thoughts and actions in sustaining a democracy. Elisa, do you want to comment on some of the thoughts that have on the questions that have been raised?
Sure. Maybe starting with Ebrima's question. So if you look at the Democracy Perception Index and some Pew research for Europe, when you ask people, do you think democracy is important? A vast majority will say yes, right? Like more than 60, 70% of people in Europe think democracy is important. When you ask them, are you satisfied with how democracy works? Then a vast majority are not, right? So I think to your point, Ebrima, I think it's people believe in the values and want to live in a democratic country, but we need a major reform or overhaul of democratic structures, institutions, political parties, so that they deliver for people. And that's what some of what Civitates funds is about, reinventing a vision of not necessarily defending democracy stuck in the past, right? But defending a new vision and building a new vision of what an inclusive democracy that delivers on those issues that people are concerned about: security, healthcare, access to education, sanitation, economic like opportunities and prosperity for their children. There is this assumption that our children will do better than us. And at the moment, we're at this moment, at least in Europe, where actually our children might not be doing better than their parents' generation, right? So I think those are really, really important questions. And if anything, I would love more philanthropic funding to go into that visionary process about what world and what kind of democracy we want for the future. I wanted to make a couple of, one of you, I think Yola maybe works in the, for migrants' rights organizations. Just wanted to flag here that civic space in Europe is closing faster for organizations, people, and activists that work on migrant rights. That speaks to what I said at the very beginning about the conservative narrative around the Great Replacement theory. People are genuinely scared in Europe now that people from Africa are going to replace them, right? And so I think that translates, whether it's intentional or not, but in government policies and police powers that are really cracking down on those organizations on the Mediterranean, in Greece, and anywhere where migrants land in Europe. And the crackdown on those organizations is just horrendous. You see something similar on environmental defenders. So especially people working on climate justice. I'm talking about Europe again here, right? Like you think of, maybe in Brazil and other places. No. This is happening in Europe. People who are protesting large mega basin in France, or, around climate, climate change issues, are also faced with disproportionate violence and arrests and everything. So I think closing civic space is very tangible for many organizations in Europe. I know we only have 2 minutes, so maybe I'll leave it at that. I think I think the French philanthropic world is starting to wake up. The Fondation de France a couple of weeks ago had a major theme around philanthropy and democracy when they brought all the owners and the founders of the hosted foundations. So that's, hundreds of foundations being hosted at Fondation de France. And one of the main themes running through the day was, how can foundations, start making a difference on issues related to democracy in France? And there were lots of questions and interests, maybe not yet money on the table, but definitely, concerns and questions from the high net worth individuals in the room about the difference they could make. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Yeah, okay, thanks a lot. I'm sorry, I see that there are other questions in the room, but we have to close at 6:30. So Amira and Peggy, I hope there's not too much frustration about closing now. Thanks a lot, Elisa, and one more time to the other speakers and person involved in this conversation, where you're really a leader at the European level, and it was a great proud to have you tonight around the table. I let Remy, the organizer of the sessions, give the concluding word. And thanks a lot for all of you, and looking forward to see you in the next session of PSSP. Remy, floor is yours for conclusion.
Thank you, Nicolas. Thank you, everyone, for being part of this. I'm going to switch to French because we're going to announce the next sessions that are happening on les rencontres de PSSP. They're all in French, so this is why I'm going to talk about it. These are in French. So, le 3 décembre prochain, nous avons une séance sur le modèle du financement associatif en crise et quel rôle peuvent jouer les fondations, avec Arnaud Trenta, qui est sociologue, Florian Covelli, qui est responsable de l'Institut français du monde associatif, et Pascal Dominique Rousseau, qui est spécialiste de la question, qui est journaliste, qui a fait beaucoup d'enquêtes sur le monde associatif. On trouvera aussi le 11 mars prochain une session sur les philanthropes et les mouvements sociaux. Donc, on voit qu'il y aura peut-être des occasions de discuter avec la séance d'aujourd'hui aussi. Quelles formes d'alliances peuvent exister entre philanthropie et mouvements sociaux, avec Julien Talpin, qui est directeur de recherche en sciences politiques, Thomas Chevalier, que j'ai pu apercevoir dans le public, qui va aussi intervenir pour parler plutôt du mouvement Black Lives Matter, et la responsable d'une initiative philanthropique française qui s'appelle la Coalition pour une philanthropie féministe, qui s'appelle Catherine Zabdoska. Et voilà. Et en juin 2025, on n'a pas encore exactement la date, mais on va avoir une nouvelle session sur les questions de philanthropie et d'exil. Donc, on avait fait une session l'année précédente à propos de début d'enquête. Et là, ce sera l'occasion pour les sociologues qui travaillent sur cette question de nous présenter en fait leur travail qu'elles ont pu accomplir. On espère vous voir nombreux et nombreuses. Et je vous rappelle qu'on est toujours, toutes nos vidéos sont, enfin, toutes les vidéos sont enregistrées et disponibles sur la chaîne YouTube de PSSP. Donc, si vous avez besoin de références, de différentes références, vous pouvez toutes les retrouver sur le lien de la chaîne YouTube. Je vous remercie. Thank you again. Et je vous souhaite une bonne fin de journée. Merci, Nicolas. Merci aux intervenantes.
Merci beaucoup, Elisa. Merci à toutes et à tous, et à très bientôt.